What's up, guys? Welcome to the first official video on this channel, I guess. For anyone that just joined, or, well, not just joined, but this is going to be a minstrel type channel with Bible studies, devotional posts, stuff like that. So as you can see here, the first one is Corinthians, but we're going to be going over it thoroughly. So it'll be starting with the backstory of Paul. And I thought I'd start Corinthians first just because it's one of the most relatable churches for most people and the most beloved of the letters, it seems like, in the Bible. What is Corinth? Okay, so Corinth, for those of you who don't know, is a place in Achaia. I think that's how you say that. In ancient Greece, it was a port town, very wealthy city, if that's the right word for it. But they had quite a few problems, especially in the new Corinth after they rebuilt themselves after being invaded by Rome. And that's when the church of Corinth is formed, is in the new Corinth. And we'll talk about those problems that the church had as we get to them in the letters. Why do we relate to Corinth so much? This is just a theory, so I don't know if it's actually correct. But Corinth seems to be in all the letters that we have in the Bible. There was way more written, but they were just taken out over time for various reasons that we have no time to explain today. But Isaiah 64:6 reads, "All of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. We all shrivel up like a leaf, and like the wind, our sins sweep us away." So, as Isaiah wrote here, that on our best days we're nothing but filthy rags, and it seems like in Corinth, at least, or the church of Corinth, was one of the most messed up churches, for lack of better terms. Backstory on the founder of the Church of Corinth. We're going to start here with the backstory. We're going way back, all the way to the beginning book of the Bible, the book of beginnings, Genesis, starting in verse 35. I'm going to be using NIV for the first few, then I'm going to switch to NASB. That's going to be the main one I'm using, but you can follow along in your own translation if you want to. So, Genesis 35:16 through 19 says this: "Then they moved on from Bethel, while they are still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty, and she was having a great difficulty in childbirth. The midwife said unto her, Don't despair, for you have another son. And she breathed her last, for she was dying. She named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem." And there's a few key terms here that relate to the story later on. Ben-Oni, which is the first name of the tribe of Benjamin, or Benjamin, who became the tribe of Benjamin, son of my suffering. And then Benjamin, his real name, means son of my right hand. And here it kind of seems like it's a foreshadowing of Jesus, but we'll talk about that later on once we get to the person who we're talking about, which I've already mentioned. And then Bethlehem means house of meat or house of bread. And Bethel just means house of God, which is a few chapters before God tells him to return to Bethel. And I don't mean to get sidetracked here, but often a lot of times that's what we need to do as Christians, is to just go back to Bethel, go back to God, go back to our foundations and our faith. Then we'll be going to the book of Judges, chapter 20, 29 through 31. We'll also be in Judges 21. And then after that, we'll be going to Samuel, 1 Samuel to be specific, and then John and Acts to finish this off. I should have clarified that at the beginning, but I kind of forgot. Then Israel set an ambush around Gibeah. They went up against the Benjamites on the third day and took up positions against Gibeah as they had done before. The Benjamites came out to meet them, and they were drawn away from the city. They began to inflict casualties on the Israelites as before, so about 30 men fell in the open field and on the roads, the one leading to Bethel and the other to Gibeah. So this is taking place right at the beginning of the civil war in Israel with the Benjamites and the other tribes of Israel. If you read through Exodus, and especially Exodus, you'll see that, well, really the whole Apocrypha, it shows that Benjamin was kind of the troubled child of the 12 tribes of Israel. And another interesting thing is when they invite, or Joseph, not they, wants to see their younger brother after he was sold off and became the, I guess you'd call it, chancellor of Egypt. He wanted to see his little brother so they'd come and get grain and live in Egypt until the famine was over. And moving a little farther into that verse or chapter to 34 and 36, once again I'm still using NIV here. Starting in verse 34, it reads, "Then 10,000 of Israel's young men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, what? And on that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjamites, all armed with swords. Then the Benjamites saw that they were beaten. Now the men of Israel have given way before Benjamin, because they relied on the ambush they had set near Gibeah." And as you can see here, with 25,100 Benjamites killed, wiped out a bunch of them. And here in the next chapter, it'll talk about how, or it doesn't really specifically say it, but it shows it, that it was kind of an important thing to keep the tribe of Benjamin alive. And I know it's kind of weird because it seems like it's pointing towards Jesus, but that he comes from the tribe of Judah. And in Judges 21, 10 through 12 says this, "And the congregation sent 12,000 of the valiant warriors there, and commanded them, saying, Go and strike down the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, with the women and the little ones. This is the thing that you shall do. You shall utterly destroy every man and every woman who is lain with a man. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan." So they went and attacked Jabesh Gilead, as it says in verse 10, just to get men or women, 400 young virgins for the Benjamites, so they wouldn't go extinct. Well, not extinct, but die out. And we'll move on to King Saul here, which is kind of a good parallel to where we're going to be starting in the New Testament. Saul, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, first became the first king of Israel, recorded in 1 Samuel. The name Saul means ask or question. I really haven't done enough studying on Saul particularly to figure out why, or the meaning behind his name, why his name means ask or question, how that relates to his reign or anything like that. Then we'll be going on to see how he ended up. His anointing is recorded in 1 Samuel 10, 20 through 24, after he led troops in battle, I believe. Thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and the Metrite family was taken, and Saul the son of Kish was taken. Sorry guys, it's kind of hard for me to read on this. But when they looked for him, he could not be found. Therefore they inquired further of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" So the Lord said, "Behold, he is hiding himself by the baggage." So they ran over and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people, from his shoulders upward. Samuel said unto his people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people." So all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king." And later on in this story of Saul, he kind of experiences a fall when he starts leading away from God, and God picks David to lead the Israelites. But Saul was still alive at that point. David defeats the Goliath, and then Saul becomes kind of terrified, well, not terrified, but worried that the people of Israel would pick him over, or pick David over him. And what made things even worse was that Saul's son Jonathan was David's best friend. And then his death is recorded at the end of that same book in Samuel 31. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And you see there it mentions Jonathan, which was a good friend to David. It actually helped him escape a couple times from his father. Excuse me. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him. He was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his men on that day together. He didn't really die a valiant death. Let's just say that. Because towards the end of his reign, he was not really what would be considered a friend of God. He wasn't as bad as Manasseh was, but clearly David had his favor because he wrote a bunch of psalms, and his son went on to be one of the wealthiest men to ever live, and one of the wisest person to ever live. And that's in, I think, 1 Kings. I could be wrong. It's been a month or so since I've been through all the Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. His burial is recorded right after what happened with his death. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in them. It came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his weapons, and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. They put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall in Bethshan. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall at Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and buried them there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. Even though he was paraded around like an enemy, kind of in a way that Mussolini was towards the end of World War II. If Yeah, I just kind of realized that. It's kind of the same way. But he eventually got buried, and they fasted for 7 days of mourning. Now we'll be moving over to the New Testament in John 16, verses 1 through 4. And then we'll eventually be talking about a man with the same name. Jesus talking on persecution. This is right after he was talking about the given the parable of the branches, and talking about, well, this is towards the middle of his talk about persecution for Christians. And he says at the beginning of chapter 16, "These things I have spoken to you so that you may be kept from stumbling. They will make you outcast from the synagogue, but an hour is coming for everyone who kills you to think that he is offering service to God. These things they will do because they have not known the Father or me. But these things I have spoken to you, so that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you of them. These things I did not say to you at the beginning, because I was with you." So he's warning them about after he dies, or even when he dies, that there will be persecution for the people that love him, and the people that do it thinks they're doing services to God, because most of the new Christians, or Christians back then, were killed by Jewish people, and we'll see that here in a minute. And Saul the Benjamite is pulling a John 16:2. Says they will make you outcast from the synagogue, but an hour is coming where everyone who kills you to think that he is offering service to God. So I'm used to the NIV where it says doing God service. But we're going to be going over to Acts chapter 9, which most of you guys should know this if you've been to church especially when you were a kid, because this was one of the most told stories of the Bible in, I don't know what you'd call that. Oh man, my brain's going blank. Bible school, or Sunday school, I mean. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters for him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. That they were being tried pretty much on the same way Jesus did, where they tried to accuse him of being against the Jewish religion, but really he wasn't. He just came to fulfill the law, as Jesus said quite a few times, actually. Moving on to the next 6 verses, it reads this: "And as he was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light of heaven flashed around him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it will be told you what you must do.'" So there's a funny story with this in debating of theology, I guess you could call it, where they were trying to debunk what actually happened to Saul. And they were saying stuff like he was having like a hallucinogenic vision because he was out in the desert sun, beating down. He was probably tired and dehydrated and hungry, and just passed out from had a hallucinogenic event. One of the funniest ones, I think, is probably when someone tried to claim that he just had an epileptic seizure right there on the road to Damascus, and that's what he supposedly seen. And the best comeback to this ever was the story of Charles H. Spurgeon. If you ever heard him, he's kind of a sarcastic guy, or seen any of his quotes. But someone was debating him on this. But before I need to preface this, that I don't know 100% if his story's true, but I heard it and I thought it was pretty funny. and a good way to remember this story. But someone tried to make that claim to C.H. Spurgeon, and he replied with, "Blessed be epilepsy if it causes conversions of that magnitude." Because it can't be just a random epileptic fit if he goes and starts churches all over the continent. Starts them in Rome and Corinth, Ephesus, Galatia, places like that. We'll move on to verse 7 here. The men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither ate or drank. So that kind of covers all. That's a quick history of Paul's lineage from the Benjamites. That's why they were, well, it seems to be why they were in such a commotion to get the Benjamites back up in population numbers, because in a way, Paul was kind of like Christ's right hand, or the Holy Spirit's right hand, I should say, which is a bad way to put it, but what I mean by that is he was used to start so many different churches in Asia, well, what's now Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Greece especially. I think Greece had like 2 or 3. Or no, not Greece. I can't think of the name of the continent, or what it was called at the time right now. And it's kind of a cool thing to see that the only 2 people mentioned in the Bible exclusively that were Benjamites that we know of was Saul and Saul. The second Saul turned to Paul. And it's also a reflection too, because Saul started out good, walking with the Lord, and then he ended in not that position. But Paul, he started in this position being a high Jew, or high in the Jewish religion, thinking he was doing God service by killing Christians. Then he had this experience walking to Damascus and started all those churches. And Lord definitely knew who he was picking when he chose Paul, because if you ever, I highly encourage you to do research on Paul, because he was a very, very intelligent man. And especially in the later book of Acts, he was his own lawyer, pretty much, when he was being persecuted in Rome. It said he could speak like 5 different dialects of Greek fluently, along with Aramaic. I think it was Latin. He was highly educated in Jerusalem in the word of the law, which what we now call the Old Testament. So yeah, it seems, well, I shouldn't say it like that, but the Lord definitely had him planned, that's for sure. Next time we'll be talking about the formation of the church in Corinth. That's also recorded in the book of Acts. So I don't know how long this ran, but hope it was at least a little informative for you guys, since I didn't really have time to do notes on this or anything, because I've been busy and haven't been able to work this into my schedule yet. But I'm definitely going to try and make it a priority. Love y'all, and God bless you. See you next time. I'll talk to you next time.